Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today we celebrate the huge cultural and chart success of Peter Gabriel's most well-known album, So, which came out and went to number one at around this time in the year 1986. Now, a lot has been said about this album. Including on this channel. It was Eddie Van Halen's favorite album. He and Wolfgang used to listen to it a lot when Wolfgang was growing up. But of all of the things that this album is really known for, I think one of its, pardon me, I think one of its most important legacies is that while the production techniques were all quintessentially 80s, unlike many albums of this era, the sound does not sound dated. And there are reasons for this beyond the obvious fact of Peter Gabriel being an ingenious songwriter, which of course he is. But there are other factors in terms of the production. Now, what is it that makes the 80s sound? Well, in a word, it sounds like the future. That is the 80s sound because at the dawn of 1980, a lot of new technology in terms of music making and music recording was coming out and it was being used in novel ways. You had things like the gated reverb effect that was used to record drums and give it that huge but not particularly resonant sound. You had drum machines which were being used in the same way. Samplers, sequencers, things like the EMU emulator, things like the Synclavier, things like the Fairlight CMI, which Peter Gabriel used a lot. What else did you have? Simmons electronic drums. You had new guitar synth effects, which allowed the guitar to sound a bit less like the guitar, and you had loads of new super polyphonic keyboards coming out. The Prophet 5 and 10, things from Oberheim, from Korg, from Roland. Yamaha was really on a roll in the 80s, and all of these synths had a lot of new and interesting sounds. Now, combine that all together and you get the 80s sound, and everyone in the 80s was using these new sounds. Soul and R&B artists were using it, mainstream rockers, singer-songwriters were using them, country artists were using them, hip hop artists were using them, every genre imaginable. And some of it sounds dated, some of it really holds up. And what this goes to show is that at the end of the day, even when you're dealing with technology that was so futuristic sounding at the time, and even today, a lot of it still sounds as though it's sort of from a different galaxy because it's so different than the kind of music that one could produce with just a regular drum set with a couple of overhead mics, guitar plugged into a Fender amp with minimal effects, an organ or electric piano. The 80s doesn't sound like that. In other words, the 80s doesn't sound like a garage band. It sounds like money. It sounds like equipment you needed to buy, which some of it is deceiving. The synths that Depeche Mode were using were relatively affordable. The drum machines and sequencers that a lot of hip hop artists were using were relatively affordable. But things like the Fairlight CMI and the Synclavier were not, and things like Simmons drums required a lot of TLC if you were taking them out on the road. But the result of all of this is that it all comes down to the humans. It comes down to the artists and how they were used. And Peter Gabriel, in terms of being an arranger and a visionary, was able to use these sounds so that they weren't used gratuitously. Oh, I like that effect that I heard on that record. I'm going to use it on mine. I like that drum sound because Def Leppard's using it. I'm going to use it on my album. No, 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 no. None of that. Everything that was done for a purpose, excruciatingly so, and every subsequent album Gabriel made took longer and longer to make. But with So, he just struck gold because it was the right combination of songs that were complex in terms of their construction and production, accessible in terms of their rhythmic pattern, of their lyrics, and of their melody. And it all came along so well. Not two songs on the album sound alike. You have so much variety in terms terms of the songwriting and in terms of the production, and I think that's why it really works. If you were to, put the gun to my head and say which 80s album with all of these 80s sounds I just described, which one stands the test of time and still sounds fresh rather than a sort of signpost of the sounds that were in vogue in a particular era, I would say it's this album. It is quintessentially 80s, but unlike a lot of quintessentially 80s albums, it's also quintessentially timeless. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.